Chapter 1: The Sound That Split the Morning. The metallic taste of dust hit the back of his throat, a heartbeat after the blast. For an instant, the newsroom froze, as if time itself had inhaled sharply and forgotten to exhale. Shards of glass chimed on the linoleum floor, a strange, crystalline rain falling in slow motion. Somewhere behind him, a kettle rolled off a table and hissed its final steam like a dying animal. The air smelled of burnt paper, hot metal, and that peculiar scent of office coffee that would never be brewed again. The portfolio, the innocent, black, worn-out thing, lay in the center of the ruined room, its handle curled like a finger pointing at nothing. Moments earlier, it had rested on a desk, looking almost bored among scattered newspapers. No one suspected it held anything other than documents. Certainly not a charge powerful enough to silence a man. A fluorescent lamp swung overhead, casting jerky shadows that jittered across the walls like panicked ghosts. The ceiling dripped small flakes of plaster. Smoke crawled lazily upward, as if uncertain whether it should flee the scene or stay and admire its handiwork. People screamed. People ran. People fell. Someone shouted the name Dmitry, so loudly it scraped the throat of the entire corridor. But there was no answer. The explosion had stolen the voice before the ear could hear it. For a moment, a brief, cruel moment, everything seemed eerily calm, the way a battlefield feels when the gunpowder has settled but the bodies haven't. Reporters staggered like marionettes whose strings had been cut. Phones dangled from their cords, beeping into the void. A calendar with a picture of a Mediterranean coast drifted from the wall, landing face first in a puddle of spilled ink. A notebook page, half-burned, fluttered across the room and stuck to a cracked window. It read only 2 words, "Final Draft." The irony was almost poetic, though poetry was in very short supply that morning. Through the smoke, someone reached toward the motionless figure on the floor, a hand trembling, fingers cold with fear. The body did not stir. The world had tilted in a single breath, and what was once a room filled with chatter, arguments, typewriter clatter, and cigarette jokes had become a crater of silence. And that silence screamed louder than the blast. You think the truth always sides with the victim. You think justice marches in like a uniformed hero, brushing off dust and declaring the guilty exposed. You're wrong. History, especially the kind written in the 1990s, has a twisted sense of humor. Sometimes the truth shows up late. Sometimes it doesn't show up at all. And sometimes, most bitterly, it disappears together with the person who tried to tell it. And today, we tell the story of the man who walked into that morning carrying a portfolio he thought contained answers. A man who never walked out again. Chapter 2: The Men Who Chased Shadows. Before the blast, before the smoke and the shattered glass, there was only a man, thin, restless, and annoyingly sincere. Dmitry Kholodov walked through Moscow the way a diver swims through dark water, cautious, alert, and painfully aware that something sharp might be waiting below the surface. He wasn't the kind of journalist who relied on charm. Charm, in his opinion, was for politicians and thieves, occasionally the same profession. Instead, he had an awkward, direct way of speaking that made powerful people uncomfortable. He would lean forward ever so slightly, eyes narrowed, as if measuring the weight of every lie before it even left your lips. He wore the same gray coat most days, a coat that never truly dried in the damp Moscow autumns. The pockets were filled with pens, folded receipts, and matchboxes he never used because he didn't smoke. He simply collected them from cafes where sources insisted on meeting in the farthest, darkest corners. The coat smelled faintly of old printer ink and cold train compartments. It was a working man's coat, meant to survive more than one season of truth hunting. Colleagues described him as serious. Friends described him as too serious. And he himself? He liked to joke that he was simply, insufficiently amused by human stupidity. It was not entirely black humor. Well, maybe dark gray. Moscow in those years was a city of contradictions sharp enough to cut. Neon billboards glowed above broken sidewalks. Mercedes cars whisked past homeless veterans wrapped in blankets that looked like they were stitched from old regrets. Bankers strutted in imported suits while pensioners counted coins twice before boarding trams. Everything felt unstable, as if the whole city were perched on a spiderweb stretched too tight. And Dmitry, with his eternal notepad and battered briefcase, moved right through this tension like someone who had forgotten to be afraid. He was drawn to stories buried under thick layers of silence. Stories no one wanted to touch because they smelled of danger, or of something even worse, bureaucracy. Rumors swirled everywhere. About money missing from military budgets. About equipment that mysteriously evaporated. About officers living far beyond their official salaries. But rumors alone meant nothing. Dmitry wanted documents, names, evidence, the kind of things that made doors slam and voices drop to whispers. He spent nights in empty offices lit only by the yellow glow of a desk lamp. He read articles until the words blurred. He followed paper trails that led to dead ends, then doubled back and found new routes. He interviewed soldiers with tired eyes and silent lips. Occasionally, someone would mutter a detail, a number, a place, and then immediately regret it, as though they'd just given away a piece of their future. Still, he pressed on. He once told a colleague, while pouring himself tea from a dented metal kettle, "Every truth is like a stray dog. If you feed it long enough, it follows you home. And then you have to decide what to do with it." His colleague laughed. Dmitry didn't. But even for a man like him, the line between bravery and recklessness was thinning. People warned him without really warning him, those half-sentences that carried weight but no clarity. You should slow down. These are complicated times. Not everyone likes inquisitive minds. Better to write about culture. Concerts. Exhibitions. He ignored them with the stubbornness of someone who had already made peace with the consequences. Yet even stubborn men have their moments of doubt. Late at night, walking home past shuttered kiosks and flickering lamps, he sometimes felt a strange sensation, not fear, exactly, but a cold awareness creeping up his spine. Footsteps behind him that weren't there. Faces he didn't recognize looking a bit too long. He brushed it off. Paranoia, he told himself. Occupational hazard. But hazards, like debts, always come due. And he hadn't realized yet that the biggest clue of his career, the one everyone said didn't exist, had already started drifting toward him like a slow, inevitable tide. He didn't know it, but the story he was chasing had begun chasing him back. And one early morning, long before the sun had a chance to warm the city, his phone would ring, the call that would set everything in motion, the call that would lead him to the portfolio resting on a train station bench. The call he would answer without hesitation. Because in those days, Dmitry Kholodov still believed the truth was worth it. Even if it bit. Chapter 3, A Call Before Dawn. The phone rang at an hour when even Moscow seemed to hold its breath. Not quite night, not yet morning, that strange gray space where the city looks like a half-erased sketch. Dmitry reached for the receiver with the sluggish reflex of a man who had gone to sleep only an hour earlier. His desk lamp was still on, casting a lonely circle of light over stacks of documents, each one demanding more from him than he had to give. "Are you awake?" The voice on the line didn't bother with greetings. Dmitry sat up straighter. Sleep evaporated like steam. "I am now," he said. Silence. The kind that suggests someone is deciding whether the truth is worth sharing, or if it's smarter to hang up and pretend the call never happened. Finally, the voice whispered, "What you're looking for." "I have it." Those words had weight. Heavy, dangerous weight. He didn't recognize the speaker. A man, likely middle-aged, cautious but determined, a person who had practiced this exact sentence before dialing. There was a faint hum in the background, a kind of rhythmic metallic clatter Dmitry couldn't place. A workshop. A train station. A warehouse. "What exactly do you have?" Dmitry asked, choosing each word like stepping stones over thin ice. "Documents. Proof. Names. Everything." A shaky breath. "You want the real story? Then meet me." The men gave a time. A location. A warning disguised as advice. "Come alone. And don't be late. Truth doesn't like waiting." Before Dmitry could ask a single follow-up question, the line went dead. A stray cat darted across the courtyard as he left his apartment. The air smelled of wet concrete and last night's drizzle. His boots splashed through shallow puddles reflecting distorted neon signs, like wounded stars bleeding color into the water. He walked quickly. He always walked quickly when he sensed a story was close, as though afraid it might sprint away if he didn't keep pace. By the time he reached the train station, the sky was still a dark slate, tinged with the weak promise of dawn. Vendors were setting up their stalls, the metal shutters screeched open like unhappy beasts. A few early commuters shuffled past, shoulders hunched, scarves up to their noses. He spotted the men immediately, not because he looked suspicious, but because he looked painfully ordinary. A beige coat that had never seen better days. A cap pulled low. Hands shoved deep into pockets, as though he wanted to hide his fingerprints from the world. The men didn't greet him. He simply gestured toward a bench. On it lay a black portfolio. "This is everything," the man muttered, keeping his face turned away. "They won't let this go public. You didn't hear it from me." "Who won't?" But the stranger was already walking away. Not running. Not panicking. Just walking fast, like a man late for a train he didn't want to board anyway. Dmitry stared at the portfolio. It looked perfectly normal. Old but sturdy. Nothing unusual except for a scuff mark near the handle. He picked it up. It was heavier than expected, a compact, strained heaviness, as though it held not documents but tightly wound tension. Instinct tugged at him. Something felt off. Not wrong, just slightly misaligned, the way a picture frame looks when it's tilted by a single, almost invisible degree. He opened his mouth to call after the stranger, but the men had vanished into the crowd. A train horn wailed in the distance, long, accusing. Dmitry exhaled, long and slow. "Great," he muttered to himself. "Either this is the lead of the year, or it's a terribly wrapped set of bricks." Dark humor helped. Sometimes it was all he had. He held the portfolio tightly, feeling the cold leather bite into his palm. Then he turned toward the exit. He needed to get back to the newsroom. To open it on familiar ground. To find out if the voice on the phone had handed him the truth, or something far more dangerous. And as he stepped outside into the pale, indifferent morning, he didn't notice the figure watching him from across the square. Didn't see the way the stranger's cigarette ember glowed briefly, then died. Dmitry walked away. He had no idea that the next time he opened that portfolio, daylight would never look the same again. Chapter 4, Threads of Iron and Smoke. The newsroom greeted Dmitry with its usual symphony of clattering keyboards, ringing phones, and half-argued debates about deadlines, coffee, and the death of objective journalism. But that morning, the familiar chaos felt distant, as though wrapped in cotton. His focus clung to the portfolio digging into his fingers. He set it on his desk with the care of someone placing an unexploded artillery shell on a dinner table. Colleagues joked in passing, as they always did. "Careful, Kholodov. Looks like trouble. Maybe it's a love letter." "Yeah, from the ministry. Signed with a bullet." He smirked, because smirking was easier than agreeing. But something inside him tightened, a subtle coil of dread. The conversation with the stranger replayed in his head, blurry at the edges, heavy in the middle. He sat. Took a breath. Unlatched the portfolio. Inside, documents. Rows of them. Pages held by rusting paper clips, maps with red circles, typed memos with signatures blacked out so heavily they looked like the censor had gone mad. He read. At first, it was the usual murk of bureaucracy, lists, stamps, vague references. Then suddenly, the murk deepened. Funds allocated but never received. Shipments recorded but never delivered. Equipment assigned to units that didn't exist. Invoices with numbers that contradicted themselves like drunks. And worse, far worse, were the testimonies. Anonymous, fragmented, but chillingly direct. The money went somewhere else. We were told not to ask questions. They said it was classified. But since when is theft classified? Dmitry rubbed the bridge of his nose. His head throbbed in that particular way it did whenever he was staring at something too big to hold with bare hands. He grabbed a notebook from his drawer and scribbled dates, initials, connecting lines. Each connection, each tiny thread, made the whole situation feel less like a puzzle and more like a trap. A colleague paused by his desk, a cigarette dangling from his lip. "You look like you found God," he said. "Worse," Dmitry murmured, eyes still on the papers. "I think I found the budget." His colleague snorted. "Burn it. It's safer." Dmitry didn't laugh. Not this time. The next 2 days blurred into a rhythm of phones, interviews, and footsteps echoing down long government hallways. He visited offices where portraits of stern generals hung above desks covered with dust and red tape. He sat in waiting rooms where secretaries gave him smiles that said, "I know nothing and I intend to keep it that way." He made inquiries that were met with stiff silences, hostile glances, and, in one case, the gentle but unmistakable suggestion that he should perhaps consider taking a vacation. "When was your last trip to the seaside, Dmitry?" "Too busy," he replied. "That is unfortunate," the man said, his tone flat as concrete. He wasn't sure if it was a warning or a threat. In those years, the difference was often theoretical. Everywhere he went, the atmosphere felt thick, heavy, as if the walls themselves were sweating secrecy. In one particularly dim corridor, he waited outside an office with flickering lights. A janitor mopping the floor leaned toward him and whispered, "You're digging in a dangerous garden. The soil there has teeth." Before Dmitry could ask what that meant, the janitor shuffled away, dragging the mop like a tired donkey. By the time he returned to the newsroom, dusk had spread across the windows like spilled ink. He felt tired, not physically but in a deeper way, like a man who had glimpsed the mechanisms behind a magic trick and found them rusty and cruel. He went over the documents again. Some pages were smudged with fingerprints not belonging to him. Some had edges torn, as if ripped out in haste. Some contained numbers that contradicted reality so perfectly they could only have been coordinated. The threads began to weave themselves. A story was forming. A big one. Maybe the biggest of his career. But something was wrong. He felt it in the way his chest tightened when he reached the last document. In the way shadows in the room seemed to lean closer. In the way every knock on the editor's door made him flinch, just a little. The truth was there, raw, ugly, undeniable. But it wasn't sitting still. It was alive, like a wounded animal backed into a corner. And wounded animals tend to bite. He leaned back in his chair, rubbing his eyes. "This is it," he whispered to himself. "This is the story." But another thought crept in, colder and quieter. Or this is the beginning of the end. He didn't know yet which one it would be. Outside, the streetlights flickered on. Inside, the portfolio, closed now, made a faint creaking sound, almost like an exhale. And somewhere far away, in a place Dmitry didn't know existed, someone struck a match and lit a cigarette, the flame reflecting in their eyes as they murmured. It started. The threads had been pulled. And the smoke was beginning to rise. Chapter 5, The Port of No Return. The morning of the explosion, though no one knew it yet, began with the sort of gray, shapeless light that makes Moscow look like it's been forgotten by the sun. Dmitry arrived at the newsroom earlier than usual, carrying the portfolio tucked under his arm like an obedient but slightly suspicious pet. A coffee machine sputtered somewhere in the corner, coughing more than brewing. The radiator clanked like a prisoner rattling his chains. Someone sneezed violently, the sound echoing through the hall like a warning shot. Dmitry set the portfolio on his desk. It landed with a dull, heavy thud. His editor, a man with the permanent aroma of instant coffee and mild disappointment, strolled in and nodded at the case. "That the famous treasure chest?" he asked. "If by treasure you mean missing military funds," Dmitry said, "then yes. Quite a chest." The editor chuckled, but there was a shadow behind the amusement, the shadow of a man who had lived through too many stories that ended with funerals and closed investigations. "Just be careful," he muttered. "Some treasures come with curses." Dmitry shrugged. "Everything's cursed in this country. It's how we know it's ours." He sat down and opened the portfolio again, intending to recheck the documents, to trace once more the constellation of numbers, names, and inconsistencies that had kept him awake for days. But something made him pause. The weight felt different. Not significantly. Barely noticeable. But different, the way a door feels when it has been opened without your knowledge. The way a photograph feels when someone has touched it with damp fingers. He frowned. Maybe exhaustion was playing tricks. He hadn't slept properly in 3 nights, even his eyelids felt like sandbags. He reached inside the portfolio. Papers. Files. Folders. Everything was there. And yet. A faint, metallic scent drifted out, so faint he almost dismissed it. But he didn't. He had smelled that scent before, cold iron, like tools left overnight in the rain. He lifted one of the folders. Beneath it, a small gap he didn't remember noticing earlier. Had he been too focused to see it? Had someone added something? Removed something? Rearranged something? He scanned the room. Reporters wandered about, carrying stacks of newspapers, arguing about headlines, debating whether statistics were lies or just misunderstandings. Nothing seemed out of place. But the atmosphere felt tilted. Like a picture frame knocked slightly askew. He shook off the thought. Paranoia again. Occupational hazard, the unofficial motto of investigative journalism. He returned to his work, notes scattered across the desk like tiny battle plans. He highlighted connections, circled dates, and muttered to himself under his breath, his pen tapping a steady rhythm. A colleague dropped by, a young reporter with a cigarette behind his ear and an optimism that would one day get beaten out of him. "So," the colleague said, leaning against the desk, "is it true? Did you finally find the magic key to the ministry's skeleton closet?" "If only," Dmitry replied. "It's more like I found the closet, the skeletons, and the people pretending they don't see the skeletons." The colleague grinned. "Sounds like a normal Monday." Dmitry smirked. For a moment, he felt almost normal. Almost safe. But then he noticed something. The portfolio, sitting innocently, quietly, had shifted. Just slightly. As though nudged. As though it wanted attention. He reached toward it, but the editor called him. "Dmitry. Need you for a moment." He stood, leaving the portfolio on the desk. Just a few minutes. What harm could a few minutes do? The argument with the editor lasted longer than expected, a discussion about publication deadlines, legal departments, the risk of printing allegations against high-ranking officials, the usual symphony of fear disguised as responsibility. By the time Dmitry returned to his desk, the newsroom was louder, busier. Phones rang non-stop. Someone spilled coffee and cursed loudly. A typewriter jammed, the key sticking like a stubborn truth refusing to be printed. The portfolio looked exactly as he had left it. Exactly. But that was the problem. Something that had shifted earlier had now unshifted itself. Or had it? Or was his mind playing tricks? He rubbed his temples. He needed sleep. A vacation, maybe. A brain transplant, ideally. He sat down. Rested his hand on the portfolio. Cold. Unusually cold. He froze. That metallic smell, faint but persistent, rose again, drifting upward like a hidden warning. He pulled his hand back. Then hesitated. Then reached again. His fingers touched the latch. The metal felt like ice. He swallowed. A tiny knot of unease tightened in his chest. "Don't be dramatic," he muttered to himself. "It's a briefcase, not Pandora's box." But Pandora, he realized too late, probably said something similar. He opened it. The world held its breath. Not because anything happened, not yet, but because something was about to. He could feel it, as tangibly as the cold leather under his fingertips. The portfolio stared back at him, silent and inscrutable. Inside lay documents. Notes. Maps. And beneath them. Something else. Something wrapped. Something compact. Something that hummed with a quiet, unnatural tension. He leaned closer. A colleague shouted something from across the room. He didn't hear it. His hand reached inside. Slowly. Blindly. Searching. And the moment his fingers grazed the foreign object, the one that didn't belong, a chill shot up his arm. He wasn't sure why. He didn't understand what it meant. Not yet. But one thing was certain. He was closer to the truth than ever. And closer to the danger he never saw coming. Because in 1 minute, maybe less, everything would change. Everything. The clock on the wall ticked. Tick. 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 And the portfolio waited, patient as fate. Chapter 6, the moment when time shattered. The second before the explosion didn't feel like a second at all. It felt like the universe pausing mid-breath, holding its lungs tight, waiting to see what he would do. Dmitry's fingers brushed the strange object inside the portfolio, cold, dense, coiled with a tension that felt alive. He froze, his pulse stuttering. For a moment, he imagined it was nothing sinister, a metal box, a forgotten recorder, a weight someone used as a paper press. But deep down, in that quiet part of the mind that always knows before the rest of you catches up, something whispered. This is wrong. He lifted the documents carefully, like peeling back layers of a secret the world wasn't supposed to see. Underneath them, wrapped in fabric, nestled tight as a clenched fist, was a device. Small. Ugly. Homemade. The kind of thing built not to survive, but to ensure someone else didn't. Dmitry blinked. His breath hitched. He opened his mouth to say something, maybe to call for help, maybe to curse, maybe to laugh at the absurdity of fate handing him a weapon disguised as truth. He never got the chance. Because in the instant his fingertips pressed against the metal, time split open. Light. A white, impossible light that tore through the room like God had opened a door no one knew existed. Sound, not a bang, not a roar, but a single, crushing note that seemed to come from inside his skull. The world folded in on itself. The desk jumped. The windows shattered outward. Papers shot into the air like startled birds. Shards of glass spun around him, glittering like cruel confetti. And yet, in the heart of the chaos, time slowed. His thoughts drifted calmly, almost lazily, as though he were floating in warm water. So this is it. All that chasing shadows, and the shadow finally bites back. I should have taken that vacation. A strange, almost comical regret flickered across his mind. He'd left a cup of tea unfinished. A perfectly good cup of tea. His last thought, unexpectedly soft, wasn't fear or panic. It was disbelief at how small the device had looked. How ordinary. How quietly it had waited inside the portfolio, pretending to be part of the story when it was the story. Then the light swallowed everything. The blast wave hit faster than thought. Chairs blew backward. Cables snapped. A typewriter ripped from its table and smashed against the far wall, keys scattering like teeth. The floor trembled. The ceiling cracked. A calendar curled into blackened ash. A telephone melted into a twisted, bubbling shape that still, absurdly, emitted a busy tone. Reporters who had been laughing moments earlier found themselves on the floor, ears ringing, eyes wide with primal confusion. Someone crawled toward the exit, leaving a smear of ink and blood. Someone else screamed without hearing their own voice. And at the center of it all lay Dmitry, still, silent, as if time had chosen not to resume for him. Smoke curled upward, painting gray spirals in the air. Flame licked through the scattered papers, devouring carefully prepared notes, testimonies, evidence, everything. Outside, pigeons scattered from the windowsill, startled into flight. A passerby looked up, puzzled by the noise, unaware of the magnitude of the moment. For a few seconds, the newsroom was nothing but ringing ears and broken light. Then the shock gave way to chaos. People rushed. People shouted. People searched for survivors. Someone cried his name, the cry cracking midair like brittle glass. But there was no answer. There never would be. And as the smoke thickened, as the flames dimmed, as the world tried to reassemble itself into something understandable, one truth stood implacably, unbearably clear. This wasn't an accident. Nor a mistake. Nor a coincidence. This was a message. Delivered in a language everyone understood, even if no one wanted to admit it. Outside, far from the sirens and screams, a man lit a cigarette with steady hands. He inhaled. Exhaled. Then walked away without looking back. And in that quiet retreat, in that casual step, the truth of the morning settled like ash. The story Dmitry had spent months chasing had closed its jaws around him. And just like that, in a flash of white light, the hunter had become the hunted. Time resumed. Life continued. But nothing, absolutely nothing, would ever be the same again. Chapter 7, Echoes in Concrete Rooms. The sirens stopped long before the questions did. By the time investigators arrived, the newsroom looked less like an office and more like a memory, something fragile, scorched, and already fading at the edges. They cordoned off the area with tape that fluttered limply in the draft, as if even the plastic ribbon was reluctant to touch the scene. The once busy room smelled of burnt paper, melted wiring, and that sour metallic tang that lingers after an explosion, the smell of endings. A police officer stepped through the rubble, boots crunching on shattered glass. He glanced around with the weary detachment of someone who had seen too much and understood too little. "Another one," he muttered under his breath, though no one asked what he meant. In a concrete room 2 floors below, the interviews began. A detective with a gray mustache and a tie that looked older than democracy sat behind a desk, flipping through a notebook. His eyes were sharp, but something in his posture suggested he'd already resigned himself to the investigation being pulled in a dozen directions before lunch. A reporter from Dmitry's team sat opposite him, nursing a bandaged wrist and an expression dangerously close to grief. "So," the detective said, pen poised. "Tell me again." The portfolio belonged to him. The reporter nodded. "Yes. He brought it in a few days ago. Said it had documents for his investigation." The detective scribbled a note, the pen scratching like a restless insect. "And you didn't notice anything unusual about it?" The reporter hesitated. He remembered Dmitry's unease. The metallic scent. The weight that felt wrong. The small, unspoken warnings stitched into every moment of the past week. But grief rewrites clarity. And fear edits memory. "No," he whispered. "It was just a portfolio." The detective didn't look convinced, but he didn't push. He simply wrote another line and turned the page, the same way history sometimes turns pages too quickly. In another room, a forensic specialist examined fragments of metal and circuitry laid out on a table under harsh fluorescent lights. "Homemade," she said to her colleague. "Crude but effective. This wasn't built for elegance. Just impact." She pointed at twisted wires. At a casing bent like a wilted flower. At remnants of a triggering mechanism that still carried the faint smell of explosives. "Someone wanted him to open it," she said, matter of fact but somber. "It wasn't meant to go off on its own." Her colleague frowned. "So it was targeted." She didn't look up. "That's not for me to say." Which was the polite, procedural way of saying yes. In the hallway outside, journalists gathered like restless birds, feathers ruffled, eyes sharp, voices rising in messy, overlapping questions. Is it true he was working on corruption in the military? Was he threatened recently? Do authorities have any suspects? Is the case political? Is anyone going to comment on what happened? Officials walked by with their jaws clenched, offering rehearsed lines that sounded hollow even before they left their mouths. "We cannot speculate. We have no information at this time. The investigation is ongoing. Please refrain from jumping to conclusions." The irony, of course, was that conclusions were already forming, spreading like cracks through the foundation of public trust. Some blamed unknown criminals. Some whispered about organized groups. Some pointed at political motives. Some insisted it was an accident, though no one really believed accidents arrive wrapped in portfolios. Inside a cramped, overheated office, a government spokesperson held a press briefing. Flashes popped like distant artillery. The spokesperson's forehead glistened under the lights. "We express our condolences," he said, voice smooth and practiced. "This tragic incident is a matter of great concern." A reporter raised a hand. "Will the investigation consider possible links to his reporting?" The spokesperson paused, too long for comfort. "We do not wish to make assumptions," he replied. "But all avenues will be explored." He shuffled his papers, trying to appear composed. One corner of the top sheet trembled. In the shadows of the city, rumors spread faster than facts. In cafes, in queues, in smoky backrooms, people whispered. He was getting too close. Someone wanted him silent. He had documents, real documents. They'll never let this come out. He knew too much. He didn't know enough to stay alive. The truth wandered among these voices, unseen, unclaimed, distorted into shapes that fit fears more than facts. And in a quiet room at the newspaper building, a room that smelled of burning insulation and grief, an investigator stood alone by Dmitry's desk. On the charred surface lay a half-burned notebook page. Only a fragment of a sentence survived. "Almost have it. Just one more piece." The investigator exhaled slowly, rubbing soot between his fingers. What piece? What had he been missing? and who had wanted to ensure he never found it. The questions hung in the air, heavy and unsatisfied. And somewhere in the distance, beyond the walls, beyond the sirens, beyond the shifting narratives, a truth remained, silent, patient, buried beneath layers of smoke and concrete. Waiting. Because stories don't end with explosions. They echo. And this one was only beginning to be heard. Chapter 8, The Men Who Weren't There. The building looked asleep from the outside. A gray government block with windows as blank as unblinking eyes. But inside, behind reinforced doors and layers of silence, several men gathered around a long table polished to a mirror shine. They were the kind of men who never appeared in newspapers. Whose names dissolved on contact with air. And whose careers existed in footnotes not meant for public release. Their suits were dark, their ties understated, their expressions carefully neutral. They smelled faintly of expensive cologne and cold cigarette smoke, the kind that lingers and will long after a decision has been made. A large clock on the wall ticked with surgical precision. Its sound filled the room like a second heartbeat. At the center of the table sat a man with thinning hair and a face that could have been carved from old limestone. He tapped a file with one finger, rhythm slow and deliberate. "So," he said quietly. "One journalist. One explosion. One spectacle." No one responded. He opened the file. Papers whispered. Photographs slid across the table, grainy images of twisted metal, blackened scraps, forensic reports written in the detached tone of people trying not to remember what they saw. "Who authorized this?" he asked. The silence deepened. A man on the left shifted slightly. His suit jacket rustled like dry leaves. "With respect," he said, "no one in this room was informed." A small, cold smile flickered at the edges of another man's mouth. "How convenient," he murmured. They reviewed timelines. Phone logs. Travel records. Intercepted messages. Layers of bureaucracy thicker than armor. Every layer pointed somewhere. And nowhere. Someone cleared his throat. The journalist had contacts. Sources. People feeding him information. The limestone-faced man nodded. And some of those people might have acted independently. A pause. Or someone wanted it to look that way. The limestone man closed the file with a soft thud, the sound of a coffin lid settling into place. "We cannot afford speculation. Not now. The public is already nervous." Someone at the far end of the table snorted softly. "When are they not nervous?" No one smiled. A younger officer, too young for the circles he was orbiting, leaned forward, eyes bright with something between fear and misplaced confidence. "With permission, we could redirect attention. Create noise. Provide alternative explanations." The limestone man studied him with mild, almost paternal pity. "You are new," he said. "And you speak of noise as if it solves anything." He looked around the room. "Gentlemen, noise is easy. Truth is inconvenient. But perception is priceless." He tapped the folder again. "This case must remain undefined." He let the word linger. Undefined. Unformed. Unfinished. The perfect shape for public confusion. They discussed strategies the way surgeons discuss amputations: clinical, emotionless, necessary. Release partial details. Hold back key facts. Allow rumors to bloom unchecked. Encourage competing narratives. Not lies. Not truths. Just ambiguity, weaponized. Someone suggested blaming organized criminals. Someone else suggested foreign interference. Someone proposed an unfortunate mishandling of equipment. The limestone-faced man raised a hand. "No. We will not point fingers." He let out a slow breath. Pointing fingers implies we know where to point. When the meeting ended, chairs scraped back. Files were collected. Voices dropped to murmurs. A few men left quickly, almost gratefully. Others lingered, reluctant to return to the surface world where cameras blinked like insects and journalists asked inconvenient questions. The limestone-faced man remained seated a moment longer, staring at the closed file as if it might open itself and offer absolution. But absolution is a luxury men in such rooms never receive. Finally, he stood. His joints cracked softly. He buttoned his jacket, adjusted his cuffs, and walked toward the exit. As he reached the door, the young officer hurried after him. "Sir," he said, "do you think the journalist had anything concrete? Anything that could still come out?" The older man paused, hand on the doorframe. "Son," he said quietly, "when someone like him dies like that, the question is never what he found." He stepped through the doorway. It's what he almost found. The door closed behind him with a final, echoing click. Far above the basement corridors, the city moved on with predictable indifference. Dogs barked. Car horns blared. People hurried to work, stepping over puddles that reflected nothing of what occurred beneath their feet. And somewhere in that restless maze of streets, a piece of truth was still out there. A fragment sharp enough to cut. Small enough to hide. Dangerous enough to kill. It hadn't surfaced yet. But stories have a way of resurfacing. Especially the ones someone tries to bury. Chapter 9, The Shadow That Kept Moving. Rain began its slow assault on the city just after midnight. Thin at first, like hesitant fingertips tapping on windows. Then heavier, until the streets shone black and slick. As if varnished for a crime scene photograph. In a small apartment overlooking the river, a man who wasn't supposed to matter sat in the dim glow of a single desk lamp. His name won't appear in official reports. His face won't be shown in documentaries. But without him, the story would have rotted quietly beneath the floorboards of history. He was one of Dmitry's sources. Not the main one. Not the brave one. Just the one who stayed alive long enough to regret it. His apartment smelled of instant coffee, old newspapers, and the damp mustiness of a place lived in by someone who knows better than to put down roots. His hand shook as he lit a cigarette, the flame trembling like a nervous confession. He scanned the street below. A lone car idled at the curb, engine humming too steadily for this neighborhood. Its headlights were off, but its presence was loud. Already, he muttered to himself. He took a slow drag. Maybe it was nothing. But in this city, nothing usually had a badge, or a grudge, or both. Hours earlier he'd received a call. A voice he didn't recognize, low and clipped. "You knew him. We need to talk." He hung up. They called again. "You worked with him. You talked to him. You helped him." He denied everything. Because denial is the last shield a man has before panic comes. The voice didn't argue. "We're sending someone." That was when he unplugged his phone and started packing the essentials. Letters, photographs, notes written in hurried shorthand. Tiny pieces of a truth Dmitry never got to publish. He stuffed everything into an old canvas bag that smelled faintly of gasoline and fear. Downstairs, the car door opened. A man stepped out. Tall. Broad shoulders. The silhouette of someone who solves problems by erasing them. The source froze. His heartbeat thudded in his throat. Sweat prickled his back. His fingers twitched toward the window latch. Not to open it, but to reassure himself it was still locked. The man walked toward the building entrance without looking up. His coat swayed with each step, too heavy for someone just avoiding the rain. The source flicked ash into an overfilled tray and whispered. "He doesn't know which apartment. He can't. But shadows always know more than they're supposed to." Across the room, on an old wooden table, lay the item the source kept glancing at. A photograph. Black and white, slightly curled at the edges. Dmitry, smiling faintly, not looking at the camera. The kind of smile people wear when they've just uncovered something important. Or when they're too tired to pretend they haven't. Beside the photo was a folded note in Dmitry's handwriting. Quick, crooked, urgent. The source didn't need to read it again. He knew it by heart. "If something happens to me, check the warehouse near the freight yard. Locker number." The last digits were smudged. A drop of coffee or rain or fate had blurred them beyond recovery. The source didn't know whether to curse or thank the universe for that. A soft knock echoed through the apartment. Not loud. Not aggressive. Just polite enough to be terrifying. Another knock. Then a voice. Open the door. We just want to talk. The source closed his eyes. Men who just want to talk never mention it through a locked door. He grabbed his bag, slung it over his shoulder, and moved toward the fire escape. The old metal frame groaned in protest as he stepped onto it. Below him, the car door opened again. Another man stepped out. Not good. He climbed down quickly, boots slipping on cold, rain-slick steel. A window opened somewhere above him. Another voice. He's moving. Now that was the truth. He reached the alley just as a flashlight beam sliced through the darkness behind him. Stop. He didn't. He sprinted, lungs burning, legs shaking. The bag thumped against his back like a reminder of everything he couldn't leave behind. His shoes splashed through puddles. Rain hammered down. The alley twisted and narrowed until it spilled into a street where neon lights reflected off wet pavement like broken promises. He ducked into a side entrance of a 24-hour laundromat. Machines rumbled. The place smelled of detergent and human exhaustion. He slid into a shadowed corner, breath frantic, chest tight. Outside, footsteps passed. Voices. Muffled. Searching. Then silence. He didn't trust it. He pulled the bag into his lap and opened it. Inside were the artifacts of a buried story. Notes detailing suspicious transfers. Names scribbled and crossed out. Maps with routes circled. Dates highlighted. And a piece of a document Dmitry once described as the fuse. Not the bomb. Just what lit it. The source ran a hand over his face. Dmitry, he whispered, what were you trying to tell me? But the dead have terrible timing. They always stay silent when you finally need them to speak. The laundromat's neon flickered. A shadow paused outside. The source stiffened. His pulse spiked. But the shadow didn't move. It waited. A silhouette in a coat. Head turned toward the door. Hand in a pocket. Minutes passed. The silhouette remained. A predator with endless patience. The source clutched the bag tighter. He suddenly understood something Dmitry must have realized long before the explosion. The truth doesn't just set you free. Sometimes it cages you. Sometimes it hunts you. Sometimes it comes wrapped in leather, humming steadily, weighing too much. He inhaled sharply. Cold air burned his lungs. If they wanted the truth so badly, then he had to stay alive long enough to deliver it. Even if the truth had already killed a better man. He stood up. Stepped toward the back exit. Every nerve in his body screamed. And then, as the door swung open, he froze. Because someone was already standing there. Waiting. Smiling a smile that held no warmth at all. You're hard to catch, the stranger whispered. The source's breath caught in his throat. And you, he whispered back, arrived too late. He dropped the bag. And ran. Into the night. Into the rain. Into whatever future a hunted man can still claim. Behind him, the shadow bent down, picked up the bag, and opened it. Inside. Nothing but laundry. Clean. Still warm. Folded perfectly. It was the first time that night someone laughed. A low, humorless chuckle. The chase wasn't over. It had just grown teeth. Chapter 10, The Price of the Last Truth. The river swallowed the dawn whole. No soft colors, no gentle light, just a gray smear rising over a city that had forgotten how to feel anything but tired. Somewhere along its embankment, hidden between rusted railings and graffiti that read like unfinished confessions, the source collapsed onto a cold concrete ledge. His clothes dripped rainwater. His breathing scraped like broken glass inside his chest. He'd run all night. Through alleyways, train yards, underground passages that smelled of mold and regret. The city had become a labyrinth designed by someone who hated him personally. He wasn't sure if he'd lost the men. He wasn't sure if men like that could be lost at all. But for the moment, there was silence. Apart from the river's slow, indifferent murmur. He clutched a small object in his fist. His insurance. His curse. Not the bag, they'd taken that decoy. That was the easy part. What mattered was the tiny cassette recorder inside his jacket pocket. Scratched. Old. Held together by tape. A relic from another era. And from Dmitry. The last thing he gave him. The last thing he said was worth dying for. The source pressed play with trembling fingers. A burst of static. Then Dmitry's voice. Tired, winded, but controlled. If you hear this. I suppose I didn't make it. The source's throat tightened painfully. Don't look for justice. It doesn't live here. It visits sometimes, then leaves a forwarding address no one can track. A faint, humorless laugh. The documents, they won't believe them. Even if you show them everything, someone will always say you made it up. Someone else will say I made it up. Someone will call it a conspiracy, someone will say it's old news, someone will ask why you're only coming forward now. The tape clicked softly as if nodding along. But there's something they can't bury, patterns. Patterns don't lie. People do. The source wiped rain from his face, though he wasn't sure if it was rain. All I know is, there's money, there's power, and there's a reason none of this ever reaches daylight. And if I'm gone, they'll say it was an accident. A long pause. Static hissed like a snake tasting the air. If they killed me, it means I was close. The tape sputtered. The voice cracked. Don't let them own the story. The recording clicked off. The silence that followed felt heavier than the river. He lowered the recorder. His fingers were numb, but he refused to drop it. This stupid plastic relic, was the last remaining heartbeat of a man the city was already beginning to forget. The newspapers had moved on. Officials released statements that sounded like they'd been printed before the meeting even happened. Public curiosity was shifting toward fresher tragedies. A journalist gone. Unfortunate. But tragedies age fast in a city this crowded. He stood slowly, joints aching, cold biting through his soaked clothes. He knew where he had to go. The freight yard. The warehouse. The locker. Even with the smudged number, there were only so many possibilities. He couldn't run forever. But he could choose where the story ended. The freight yard was a graveyard of steel. Cranes loomed overhead like skeletons of extinct giants. Containers stretched in rows so perfect they looked unnatural. Symmetry forced upon chaos. A train horn wailed in the distance, long and mournful. As if warning him. But fear had stopped being a signal. It had become a companion. He moved between the containers, drawn toward the warehouse Dmitry had mentioned. Its metal walls were streaked with rust so dark it looked like dried blood. Inside, the air tasted of dust and diesel fumes. Lockers lined one wall. Dozens of them, dented, neglected, identical. The source's breath fogged in the cold air. He began checking them one by one. Hands shaking. Heart pounding. Each lock more stubborn than the last. Minutes passed. Maybe hours. And then. A dull click. Locker number 28 opened with a metallic sigh. Inside. A single envelope. No markings. No seal. Just weight. Enough weight to make his stomach twist. He reached inside. And froze. Footsteps behind him. Slow. Purposeful. Unhurried. He didn't turn around. A voice spoke from the shadows. Low. Calm. Almost gentle. Impressive. Most people would have fled the country by now. The source felt sweat beat along his spine despite the cold. He closed his hand around the envelope. What happens now? He asked. A soft exhale, half amusement, half pity. That depends. You can give me what you found. Walk away. Stay alive. Forget this ever happened. A pause. Or you can open it. The source swallowed hard. And if I open it? The stranger stepped closer. Just one step. Enough for his silhouette to appear in the dim light. Then you won't walk away. A simple statement. Not a threat. A rule. The source looked down at the envelope. Everything Dmitry died for. Everything men in dark rooms debated. Everything someone was willing to kill to bury. Truth. Or the shape of it. He held it like a live grenade. His pulse thundered in his ears. Could he really do what Dmitry couldn't finish? Was he brave? Or selfish? Or just tired of running? He tore the envelope open. Paper rustled like wings snapping. The stranger sighed. Wrong choice. The source didn't look back. He stepped forward, past the lockers, past the shadows, past the men whose footsteps echoed behind him like the countdown of a fuse. He walked into the daylight. Cold. Harsh. Unforgiving. He knew he wouldn't make it far. No one ever does in stories like this. But as he walked, he whispered to himself. At least now, they can't bury all of it. The papers in his hand fluttered in the wind. Names. Dates. Transfers. Connections. A map of a truth too heavy for one life. But enough to crack the ground. Maybe just enough. Behind him, footsteps approached. Calm. Steady. Inevitable. The source didn't run. Running was for men who believed they could escape. He just kept walking. Toward the city. Toward the end. Because sometimes a story refuses to die with the men who started it. Sometimes it demands another body. And sometimes the truth disappears. Not because no one looked for it, but because everyone who carried it was swallowed up by the same silence. A silence that now closed in around him. One step. Then another. Then no more footsteps at all. The city breathed. The river flowed. The freight yard settled back into stillness. And the pages he held caught the wind, scattering across the concrete. Like pieces of a story. No one was supposed to finish. Epilogue, ashes don't lie. The wind carried the papers farther than anyone expected. Some landed in puddles. Some snagged on fences. Some pressed themselves against passing cars like desperate hands begging to be noticed. Most were ignored. A few were picked up. One page fluttered into the hands of a street cleaner who squinted at the fine print, shrugged, and stuffed it into his coat pocket to use later as something to wrap his sandwiches in. Another landed at the feet of a young woman waiting for a bus. She read 2 lines, frowned, and murmured. Someone's going to be looking for this. She placed it carefully inside her book and never mentioned it to anyone. A third page disappeared beneath the wheel of a delivery truck, pressed flat into the wet asphalt until the ink smudged into a dark abstraction that looked like spilled truth. The warehouse. Empty. Echoing. The locker door swayed slightly, banging softly like a heartbeat out of time. No body was found. Not officially. Authorities filed a brief statement about possible trespassing. Possible theft. Possible misunderstanding. And then decisively decided to stop using the word possible altogether. The case gained a new footnote. Then another. Then silence. Silence is cheaper than answers. And more convenient. Somewhere in the city, an old cassette recorder changed hands. Passed quietly from one person to another. No signatures. No questions. A chain made not of trust, but of stubbornness. Dmitry's voice traveled further than his life ever did. A few journalists heard it. A few didn't want to. One cried. One laughed bitterly. One poured a drink and said, "He warned us." And we still didn't listen. But they kept a copy. Just in case. Stories have a strange way of resurrecting themselves. Especially the dangerous ones. As months passed, memories faded. The newsroom rebuilt itself. New faces filled old desks. A fresh pot of coffee brewed where the explosion once left its permanent scar. People walked by that spot every day. Some felt a chill. Most didn't feel anything at all. Time is the best accomplice of forgetting. It always has been. But late at night, when only the cleaning crew moved through the dim corridors, someone sometimes found a scrap of burnt paper wedged behind a filing cabinet or under a radiator. Old. Fragile. Edges charred. Always the same handwriting. Always the same unfinished line. Just one more piece. The cleaners never reported it. They simply left it where it was. Some stories aren't meant to be thrown away. They wait. Patient. Wounded. Incomplete. Across the river, a man in a dark office closed a folder stamped with a date long past. He placed it on a shelf among many others. Files that hummed with secrets like wasps trapped in jars. He turned off the light. For a moment, in the darkness, he spoke softly to no one. It's never the story that kills. It's the part people aren't ready to hear. Then he left, locking the silence behind him. And the city exhaled. Another night. Another truth folded into the underground layers of memory where only ghosts keep track. Dmitry's ghost. It doesn't haunt rooms. It haunts questions. The kind that linger. The kind that sting. The kind that demand a price. Because in the end, as the river drags the dawn across the skyline, and the last echoes of the chase dissolve into the hum of traffic, one fact remains. Sometimes the truth disappears with the people who carried it. And sometimes it survives because they didn't. The end.